This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. There's nothing sweeter than baking cookies during the holidays. With Prime, I get all my ingredients delivered right to my door, fast and free, no last-minute store trips needed. And of course, I blast my favorite holiday playlist on Amazon Music. It's the ultimate soundtrack for creating unforgettable memories. From streaming to shopping, it's on Prime. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to get more out of whatever you're into.
With Lululemon, the real gift happens when they're living in it. When you give them the softest loungewear set, the real gift is this. And this. And this. This holiday, Lululemon makes it easy to give a gift that goes beyond. Open the moment. Shop now at Lululemon.com.
Fit Nation. It's Fit Nation. It's Fit Nation. Awesome. All right. Welcome back to Misfit Nation. If you are a veteran and you are struggling or feel like you are leading a path towards the darkness, stop and think about those who are around you. Think about how they truly value you, how they will miss you. You are not alone. You need to talk to someone. Someone will listen to you. If you feel like you don't have friends or family in your circle that would support you, or you're embarrassed to talk to them, you'll be a burden to them, call the 1-800 number, the hotline for mental health services at 1-800-273-8255, and take option 1. Don't make a permanent solution to a temporary problem. If you're a new listener, thanks for joining us. Please subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast apps. This includes the Military Broadcast Radio app, and check out our family of shows there, all hosted by veterans. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel at _Misfit Nation. That's _Misfit Nation. This will keep you up to date with all our latest shows, episodes, and of course, stories of our guests. Speaking of which, this show is part of our Memorial Day series for the month of May. We are bringing in fellow service members and family members of those who we have lost to share their stories. And right now we have active duty service member of 17 years, 17 long, wonderful years, Jeffrey on the line from Camp Pendleton. Jeffrey, how you doing? Welcome to the Misfit Nation.
Thank you so much for having me. So we had for the listeners out there, it was a private joke between myself and Rich. He asked me how long I've been in, and it just rolled out of my tongue saying, 17 long, miserable years. And, being a service member and active duty service member and veterans, that's what we thrive on is all that dark humor, Yes. That's what keeps us going, especially when we're in the suck, right? So speaking of the suck, I have been in for 17 years. I'm hoping to continue on for another 3, reach that 20, and then made a quiet promise to myself to do another 3 years on top of that. So 23 years is when I'll call it quits and make room for somebody else.
Hang up them boots and let some young boot come in and put them on and do the job for you.
Exactly. And then I can, I'm not going to grow out a beard because I can't grow out beards. My face is, being Asian, it's an impossibility for me. But, maybe I'll be cantankerous and salty. I like being cantankerous and salty, which is what I do anyway. But yeah, 17 years has been really good. I really, really enjoyed my time in, and as just like everybody else who's served, I will miss the camaraderie. You
miss that right away as soon as you put on a different outfit and go to work with a different environment. Like
even though for however long of a time you've been in, you bitch and moan and you complain about, I have duty, I have this, I have watch, I have blah, I've got whatever. As soon as you get out of those gates, you're like, ugh, I miss those morons. I miss those idiots jumping off of the barracks, breaking their legs. I miss all the good times.
Not that all these things actually happen.
No, they don't. They do not happen in this great military that it is. It might happen in Russia, but who knows? Who knows? But even if they have a viable military, anyway. So I got invited to talk about, not about me, because my service is a bit, meh. It's a bit blah. I didn't do any of the big glory services or deployments or what have you. I made some dents. I fought against Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Fought for open service, marriage equality, all that stuff. But I guess the one thing that I'm super proud of is I made a teeny tiny minuscule contribution in honoring my dad. My dad, so I'm one of 10 kids.
Oh.
Yeah. So my dad is a World War II veteran. He was born in the 1920s. He enlisted in the Philippine Army first, and right when the Japanese decided to make their coming out party over Pearl Harbor, the Philippine Army got absorbed into the US Army, which, as you do. And so for 4 months, really, from December 7th, 1941 till April 9th, 1942, my dad and the army that he served in, MacArthur and all those guys, they held off the Japanese for 4 months in what was known as the Battle of Bataan in the Philippines. The Bataan campaign was a bloody campaign. It was one of the earliest real significant defeats for the military, the US military in its history. And something happened out of Bataan that really encapsulated the whole mythos of that battle. When MacArthur was ordered to leave the Bataan Peninsula, the Philippine and American troops, they had to surrender. There was no going around it. I mean, they wanted to fight, but they didn't have enough supplies. They didn't have enough food. They were slowly getting whittled down. They got to the point where when the Japanese advanced from the north of the Philippines all the way down to the appendix that is the Bataan Peninsula, they were all getting captured, and they were getting pushed out into the fortress of Corregidor, which is a tiny, tiny island. Eventually, General Wainwright just gave up. He just said, you know what? Because I want to preserve human life, I'm going to surrender, and we'll see how it goes. Hopefully, the Japanese will treat us like soldiers, and sure enough, they didn't. And so, thus began this atrocity called the Bataan Death March, which my dad was part of. The Bataan Death March was, like I said, it was an atrocity and a violation of what we now know as the Geneva Conventions or the rule of war. You had one of the largest armies surrender en masse. 75,000, was it 75,000? Yeah, 75,000 troops surrendered to the Japanese, a vastly inferior army and severely outnumbered. They won, and they had to transport this large body of surrendered troops from point A to point B, because where are you going to keep them, right? So when they identified an old barracks in the middle of Luzon Island, they decided to march all 75,000 of them from point of surrender to that POW camp. That was 60 miles on foot, and it took them about a week. I didn't hear about this story until later on in life, when my dad was getting older, and some of my family historians, they would mention it, like, oh yeah, your dad was in this thing called the Bataan Death March, the Death March this, the Death March that. I'm like, oh my God, I'm sick and tired of the Death March. But it turns out that it was a very significant part of our own family's history. He survived the Death March, but along the way, he saw probably the grossest violations of human life. by a conquering army. What we're seeing in Russia right now with how the Russians are treating Ukrainian civilians, it's along those lines. But imagine like a week or two, a long column of defeated troops who are emaciated. They didn't have food. They had no medical supplies. They had nothing. And they're being forced to march these 60 miles under duress, sometimes tied up, sometimes wounded by the Japanese. And along the way, they're getting beaten. They're getting murdered. They're getting abused. If you were a civilian along the route and you were caught helping these troops with food or whatever, they were beaten and they were abused, and sometimes they were killed. So at the conclusion of this long, arduous death march, my dad somehow survived. He was incarcerated in a prisoner of war camp called Camp O'Donnell. That used to be a basic training army base. So the Filipinos would go train over there and become part of the Philippine Army and so on and so forth. But logistically speaking, the Japanese saw this base as the perfect holding area for all these POWs. And, and to be frank, if you were a conquering army, that's what you would use, right? You'd use your enemy's space to hold all these prisoners. Unfortunately, the base wasn't that big. So you had 75,000 troops. Approximately 10,000 of them were Americans. So they were segregated into two areas. One camp were just for the Americans, and the other camp were for all the Filipinos. I don't want to say that the Americans got it better than the Filipinos, because neither of those guys got any reprieve. I mean, my dad, when I was interviewing him for a thesis project, he was conjuring up memories like, oh, I was part of a mass burial detail. So I would dig up a 10-foot by 10-foot by 10-foot mass grave, and I would bury people in there. He was in that camp for 7 months, a full deployment.
Yeah.
And in those 7 months, he contracted a whole host of diseases: beriberi, yellow fever, typhoid, malaria, whatever. It's on his record, and if you want, I'll show you those paperwork afterwards. He got so deathly ill, and again, this is part of his whole storytelling. He got so deathly ill that, living with all these emaciated bodies was not an option for him. So what he did was, because these huts were on stilts, as most Filipino architecture was at the time, because of the rain, he hid underneath the huts where he had to recuperate. That's where he recuperated. Now, imagine, it's a fairly sizable, those HESCO huts that we had in like Camp Wilson or whatever, and these massive training areas. Imagine those huts, but then you're cramped with like 100 guys in there.
Right.
And they're all packed like sardines, and they're all sick, and they're all starving, and they're all wounded, and it's just miserable. The worst of the worst. And my dad was underneath all that. So all of these bodily fluids, all these excrements, all this crap, it eventually fell on him, right? Another part of the story is that he stayed under that hut, away from everybody else, and thankfully away from the Japanese, because they would do their, rounds, as it were, and pick up random people and murder them, or make them disappear. It rained one time in the camp, and it rained so much that he was able to be revived because of the cool water. And that's how he survived, right? if it wasn't for that rain and the fact that he, and I'm quoting him because I'm not religious, he prayed the most beautiful prayer that he could ever come up with because he's Catholic. He did so many Hail Marys and so many rosaries and so many this, that he believed that God Almighty came down and gave and provided him that rain and allowed him to live. Now, you'd think that living through 7 months of that pure hell, that's it, you'd be dead, right? Miraculously, a whole bunch of dudes actually survived that camp. Some of them were transported to Japan. Some of them were moved to other camps. My dad had a very different story. Now, while he was languishing in this camp, actually, let me reverse back. When he enlisted with a friend. And he was with that same friend for his basic training, his A school, as it were, all the way to the Battle of Bataan, to surrender to the Bataan Death March, to incarceration as a POW. Now, along that route, his friend got wounded, or he was sick enough that he somehow received amnesty and was released by the Japanese. Because the Japanese had that. They pretty much said, we need to have the Filipinos on our side. So, let's release some of the most sickly and wounded, and maybe they'll see things our way and they'll become our allies, and whatever. It didn't turn out that way. So my dad's friend went all the way back to our hometown, which was 300 miles away on the other side of the country, found my grandfather, and even in his near-death state, told my grandfather, your son is still alive in this camp. You need to rescue him or he will die.
Wow.
So my grandfather gathered whatever he could in terms of money and possessions, left his family of 11 kids. Are you keeping track of the number? Left his large family and made the 300-mile trek through enemy lines, through combat, all the way to Manila, which was declared an open city. Once he got to Manila and he successfully evaded the Japanese and a lot of the actual combat, allegedly he stayed at like churches and chapels and whatnot when he had to rest and continued on his way. When he got to Manila, he went straight to the Red Cross, which was still functioning. God knows how, but they were.
Oh,
they were still functioning. I mean, I guess if Manila was declared an open city by the Japanese, by the conquering army, then yeah, you've got a chance to still operate. So my grandfather became a volunteer corpsman, which is what I am, by the way. I'm a hospital corpsman in the Navy. He made it his personal task to go through and see every single camp where wounded Americans and wounded Filipinos are to find his son.
Wow.
So he managed, I don't know how he did it, but he managed to get to my dad's camp, which in Camp O'Donnell. It's about 60 miles from Manila inland. It's near what was known as Clark Air Force Base. I mean, it's still called Clark. It's in the middle of the Luzon Island. My grandfather made it all the way to that camp, got into the camp with a bunch of other Red Cross workers to provide aid to the wounded. And he made it his business to visit every single hut to visually look for his son. Now, if you've been out in combat for a while, combat changes people, right? It happens. Now, imagine if you've been beaten, you've been starved, you've been denied medical help, you've been dehydrated, you've been abused. Your physical manifestation, your physical appearance is going to change like no other. You're a whole different person. The story goes that my dad, when he saw my grandfather, his dad, walking through the same hut that he was in, he reached out to him and he said, Papa, it's me, it's your son. It's your son Espiritu. And my grandfather didn't recognize him because he was just skin and bone. If you've ever seen pictures of those prisoners of war in the Bataan Death March, some of them were just wearing loincloths. And you can see the rib cages, they're thin, they're emaciated, walking skeletons. And that's what my dad was. The only way that my grandfather recognized my dad was because of the scar that he had in his hand. And knowing that he saw that scar on the right hand, he's like, oh my God, it's my son. I cannot believe I found you. So he gave him, after a bit of a tearful reunion, my grandfather told my dad, here's some food, here's some meager supplies. What I need you to do is I need you to wait here and I'll be back for you. So my grandfather, when he left, obviously my dad didn't want him to leave because he just saw his family for the first time in a combat zone of all places. My grandfather left. He came back a couple of days later to that same camp, found his son, and told him, gather up your things, we're leaving. Oh, wow. We're like, what? What do you mean gather up my things, we're leaving? No, we're getting out of here. Like, we're going to make a run for it. So I guess the theory goes is that my granddad, used the same excuse of, oh, we're going to take all these emaciated people out because they're super sick, and we're going to take them back and take care of them. My dad, even in his weakened, defeated, damn near dead state, told my grandfather, we got to bring some of these guys out. And so at random, they grabbed 10 guys.
Oh, wow.
10 guys, right? And just walked out the gate.
Outstanding.
Right by the Japanese guards. I'm pretty sure they got bribed. I mean, you just can't walk into a camp and be like, we're taking these 10 dudes out. I'm pretty sure they got bribed, but they walked out of that gate and disappeared. So for the next couple of years, until the Americans came back and liberated the Philippines, my dad was in hiding. He was recuperating. First in Manila, and then he went underground. He joined the resistance movement in the Philippines. And as soon as the American army came back after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, he reconnected and rejoined the American army. And he continued to serve until he became a staff sergeant, an E6. He then, subsequently he left the U.S. Army, became a successful lawyer in our town, and raised a family of 10 kids. But, his story doesn't end after combat. His story of struggle and trauma, I'd like that, I'm using that term very broadly, it continued for a long, long time, almost to the day till he died, which was in 2012. So after the end of World War II, when the Philippines received independence, President Truman was forced to sign what was called the Rescission Act of 1946. The Rescission Act stated that because the Philippines received their independence, all of the issues that happened in the Philippines, all of those problems, they're now Filipino problems. To include veterans benefits. So you know how we have this ongoing battle with GI Bill and our benefits being so backlogged and whatnot? My dad had to fight that for 70 years.
Oh, it's like, good Lord.
So he was fighting not just the Philippine Army to get his service be recognized, one. Two, he had to fight the US military to get his benefits, which, and I hate to say it, but it took him a while to get his US citizenship. That was part of the deal. When FDR said the Filipinos fight for America or help us in defending democracy, you will be given a pathway to citizenship. That's how they got a lot of enlistees from the Philippines. Well, when the Rescission Act came in 1946, guess what? That promise, gone.
Oh, man.
All gone. 250,000 Filipino troops didn't get their citizenship, even though they were faced with like the worst form of combat at the time, or they were prisoners of war. So there's that aspect. The other aspect is their veterans benefits. They didn't get it. It went on for decades. It finally got resolved under President Obama. I legit saw a check for my dad. It was from the Department of the Treasury for $15,000.
Wow.
That was his payment and restitution and or benefits, or whatever euphemism you'd like to use, because of that bill that was passed. I forget what the name of that bill was. So that was phase one. There were still fights that were going on in DC to get Filipino veterans recognized for their contribution in the war, or their families recognized. And that's when I come in. So I found out that there was an organization called the Filipino Veterans Recognition and Education Project. Obviously, it's a Filipino veterans group, and their whole mission is to try and get the US government to recognize Filipinos for their service in World War II. So in 2016, President Obama signed the bill. And it was like one of those cathartic moments where both sides of the political spectrum had zero issues with a bill.
One time.
It's like the one time. It's like Democrats and Republicans, they read the bill. They're like, I don't see a problem. Nobody's going to fight this. So they all, both Congress and Senate, they voted for it. It went straight to Obama's desk and he signed it. Instantly, you had all these veterans that qualified for the Congressional Gold Medal.
Wow.
To include my dad. So in 2017, I believe it was, I showed up in San Francisco and a Congressional Gold Medal was presented to me as a representative of my dad and his family. And we received this Congressional Gold Medal.
But
it didn't end. That didn't end. So we finally caught up, and we're finally given the due diligence and the due care and recognition for these veterans. But the fight goes on in some ways. And you've probably seen my profile pics. I'm always dressed up as a Stormtrooper. So that's a gimmick. I run 5Ks, I do 10Ks, marathons, half marathons as an Imperial Stormtrooper for fundraising purposes.
Outstanding.
So during COVID, I raised like $20,000 doing various half marathons and full marathons. I did the Marine Corps Ultra Marathon, all to raise monies for these different groups like the Filipino Veterans Education Program, other veterans organizations, LGBT causes, whatever the case may be. But I've been able to raise successfully like or do 3 different fundraisers for the Filipino Veterans Recognition Project, and managed to get like 50 congressional gold medals funded.
That is outstanding.
So that's what I do. I mean, again, my service is not as glorious as others, but that's my little contribution to the cause, as it were.
Don't downplay your service. You've done 17 years of great service. I know we spoke earlier with our dark humor, but that's 17 years of your life that you've given to this country in uniform, and you're on the green side. You're a green side Navy guy right now. You're a muddy Navy guy working with the Marines at Camp Pendleton. So you get to see some wild and crazy stuff there. I don't care what you're saying about downplaying. You're doing great things for your country. And your dad, my God, it's like a movie. But it's like a movie. You can make that into a movie both in Tagalog and in English, and sell that thing around the world. Maybe you get an Oscar. Maybe you could punch someone in the face on the stage and get away with it, because I think you would in this matter.
I'll probably get punched in the stage somehow. That'll be probably from my family. We're like, oh my God, you didn't do this right.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah. I think it's a great story of your dad, and wow. Did he ever get to see his friend again, who actually told your grandfather where he was?
I believe so, but not for very long.
Okay.
I do remember seeing an old photo of my dad back in the 70s, because, after the war and after he got his law degree, he became a big veterans advocate. He also became a big community organizer. He was always out there, we grew up poor. We grew up in the Philippines, out in the country, where we only had each other, but your name carries weight. So if you're a lawyer and you do all these cases and you work to help the community in general, you're able to get some kind of credibility. So he used his name to do community works, community projects, support local political causes, not like township stuff, city council. But I saw this one picture of him wearing these kick-ass shades from the 70s, like those half-faded shades, right? Wearing a wife beater. Him and like 10 other guys with their pants rolled up, digging a trench for an irrigation for a rice paddy. And I'm like, that is not something I would do, because I am an office bitch. But that is cool.
At that point, he's over 50 years old doing that.
Yeah. I mean, every time I think about that story about, surviving the Bataan Death March and going through the POW camp experience, it puts things into perspective. Like, my issues are nothing compared to what he went through. So whenever we go to or if I go to like an exercise or whatever, and it sucks out there, it's raining or whatever, I'm like, yeah, it could be worse. I could be being, taken off to a rice paddy and murdered by some Japanese dude.
Statement. It could always be worse. And your dad lived through a horrible experience there, and I appreciate you sharing that with the Misfit Nation.
No, it's my pleasure.
Is any way listeners can help you with your fundraising? Any website they can go to, or how to contact you to maybe get involved with your Stormtrooper fundraising?
Oh, it's really not that big of a deal of a fundraiser, but I'm on Facebook. You can always find me. I'm on Instagram, Stormtrooper Jeff. There was it's literally my moniker, Stormtrooper Jeff. If you Google me, Stormtrooper Jeff, that's who shows up. It's Maya Bismag.
Writing it down so I don't forget.
But yeah, that's very nice of you to ask. Typically, I just do online fundraisers, because I don't like dealing with money. So it goes straight from the Facebook fundraising profile to the organization, so I don't have to deal with it. I just do all the hard work. So
you embrace the suck while the money flows. It's good.
Exactly, and that makes it a little bit more worthwhile. Now, I will say sometimes it does get tedious, because you see your donation pool and it's sitting at $10, and your target is $2,000. You're like, ugh.
Come on, people.
What can I do? Do I need to start an OnlyFans or something? Like, what do I need to do?
Need to just wear the mask?
Yeah, I'll do a strip show with my mask, but what do you want?
How far do I have to go? And if do I need to stop to get more money too? Or
yeah, exactly. You got to do what you got to do. But whatever amount I raise, it's still better than zero.
Exactly.
So
that's a great attitude, a great story again. Jeff, thank you for agreeing to come on here and share with the Misfit Nation a great story of a great service of your dad and his continued service for almost 60, 70 years, almost 70 years after service. He still served country and served his heritage and people to try to get what was their just due to them. And that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me.
No problem, brother. Enjoy the rest of your day at Camp Pendleton.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's going to be tough.
All right. You know how we do this. Thanks for taking some of your time to spend with us on Misfit Nation. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and share the link as much as possible. If you want to, please become a supporter to help us carry this thing on. We appreciate you. If you know someone that brings that energy, has a great story, is an up-and-comer in the industry of music, in the arts, have them reach out to us on themisfitnation.com. We will get back to them within one day and get them on here so they can share their story with the world. As always, till next time, be humble, stay hungry, and keep hustling, because we are Fit Nation.